Have you ever teleported your protagonist across the map to avoid riding a boring travel sequence? Well, bypassing the journey saves time, yes, but rushing a faction from point A to point B actually robs the story of a vital test. Too many writers mistakenly believe that momentum requires to skip the march and jump right to the destination. Ignoring the friction of movement, however, leaves characters totally unchallenged, and that puts your entire story at risk unless you start to understand what the journey actually accomplishes. Nothing shatters reader immersion faster than a massive group of people moving across a continent like a slick map marker. When a writer treats an army or a caravan as one unified entity, like a blob with legs, the world loses all its teeth and the journey stops feeling like a journey at all. A block of thousands of humans suddenly operates with the hive mind efficiency of a migrating flock. Readers notice this unnatural smoothness immediately. The human brain instinctively knows that large crowds are inherently chaotic. Moving even just 50 people across a modern parking lot already requires shouting and inevitable delays. Scaling that number up to an entire faction marching across wild terrain should multiply that friction exponentially. Readers ultimately crave the struggle of survival, which means that once the weightlessness of taking the shortcut has set in, no amount of dramatic dialogue at the destination can compensate for the absence of genuine suffering in between. To make this concrete, consider Princess Ozara, a young ruler who has just survived a violent coup in her capital city and is now leading 2,000 loyalists on foot across the Frost Marches, a frozen stretch of highland notorious for killing unprepared travelers even in mild seasons. The scene opens with genuine electricity. Ozara on horseback, her breath clouding in the freezing air, watching the last of her people pour through the city gates before the usurper's forces seal them shut. Now, the made-up writer here has built something real with this. A leader suddenly responsible for thousands of desperate lives, a landscape designed to kill, and a political clock ticking back in the capital. And then, in the space of a single chapter break, Ozara arrives at the rebel stronghold. Weeks of travel compressed into a single line. They reach the fortress at Keldrath on the 23rd day, weary but alive. Just like that, the Frost Marches, weeks of sub-zero wind, dwindling rations, and exhausted soldiers become a brisk weekend hike, and the writer has done it with the best of intentions. You see, the instinct behind this choice is completely understandable. The writer knows exactly where the real story is, and that's at Keldrath, where the political negotiations begin and the next confrontation waits. Staying in the frozen march feels like stalling, like asking the reader to watch someone trudge through snow for 20 pages when there are battles and betrayals on the other side. So driven by a genuine desire to respect the reader's time, the writer fast travels past the friction and accidentally hollows out the entire manuscript. The reason this trap is so hard to see is that most writers have spent decades being trained to accept it as correct craft. Film does this constantly and brilliantly, because the camera has physical limitations that prose simply doesn't share. A 2-hour movie about a medieval army crossing a mountain range cannot spend 40 minutes on the crossing without hemorrhaging its audience. So directors cut to sweeping helicopter shots of the column moving across a ridge. The score swells, and we accept the compression because we've been given something visually spectacular in exchange for the narrative skip. Video games codified this even further. Once you've visited a location, you fast travel back at will, and the map becomes a menu rather than a place. And then of course there's the writing advice, which has hammered the same note for years. Cut the boring parts, kill your darlings, don't let the pacing drag. All of that advice is true in the right context, and applying it to a travel sequence feels completely logical because travel sounds boring by definition. Getting from A to B sounds like the connective tissue between the interesting parts, so many writers cut it with confidence, convinced they are doing exactly what their craft education told them to do. The problem is that by fast traveling Ozara across the Frost Marches, the writer has quietly destroyed several things that cannot be rebuilt at their destination. Let's start with Ozara herself. She arrives at Keldrath having never actually led her people through anything. She made a dramatic exit and then she showed up at the finish line, and in between the narrative just trusted that she handled it. The reader has no evidence of her competence. No window into her judgment under pressure. No moment where they watched her make a choice that cost something. Which means her authority at Keldrath rests on the writer's assertion rather than earned dramatic proof. When Osaru eventually stands in front of the rebel council and argues that she deserves their support because of everything she endured to reach them, the reader has no emotional memory to attach to that claim. The suffering to them is a rumor, and the 2,000 loyalists who made the crossing with her, they've become a statistic, a headcount that follows Osaru around like a number attached to her title. They were never a responsibility she had to manage under real conditions, so they carry no dramatic weight. But with that said, the Frost Marches themselves suffer the worst fate of all, because skipping the crossing reveals that the frozen wilderness was never actually a threat. Readers absorb environment strictly through consequence, meaning the moment a landscape produces 0 deaths or impossible choices, it registers as a painted backdrop. The writer may have spent pages establishing how brutal the Frost Marches are, describing the killing wind and the bone-deep cold, but if the faction simply walks through all of that and arrives intact, the reader's subconscious quietly files the setting under decorative. And once the setting is labeled like that, every future threat the writer introduces carries the faint suspicion that it too might be decorative, that the world is a series of impressive descriptions rather than a genuinely dangerous place. What's important to understand here is that the tension doesn't just drop in this section, it retroactively undermines the sections that follow. The Rebel Council scenes at Keldrath should feel tense partly because the reader carries the physical memory of how hard it was to get there, but instead they arrive at those scenes clean and rested, emotionally speaking, with nothing at stake except whatever the dialogue tells them to feel. And the crazy part is that none of this damage actually announces itself. A reader won't close the book and say, I think the journey sequence was under-dramatized. They'll just feel a vague sense that the world is thin, or that Osaru seems strangely passive for a leader. And the writer will have no idea that both of those impressions trace back to a single chapter break in the Frost Marches. The problem buries itself in the manuscript and spreads invisibly, and that is precisely what makes it so dangerous to leave unexamined. Escaping the pull of that visual conditioning, the montage instinct, the fast travel reflex, requires more than just slowing down a travel sequence. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about what a crowd in motion actually is. The shift that breaks the fast travel reflex starts with abandoning the idea that a faction is a single object moving across a map. A column of 2,000 people is a fragile ecosystem held together by string and prayer, where every splintered wagon and exhausted soldier represents a separate dependency that can fail at any moment and drag the rest down with it. Once you start seeing the journey through that lens, the entire purpose of the travel sequence flips on its head. The march stops being a logistical inconvenience the writer has to apologize for and becomes the single best stress test available. A sustained pressure cooker where raw competence and fragile loyalty get exposed in ways most other scenes could never match. Princess Osaru making speeches in her throne room tells you what she believes about herself, but Osaru managing 2,000 desperate people across a frozen wilderness tells you what she actually is, and those things are rarely the same. Honestly, this is where the protagonist becomes real to the reader. The journey isn't the connective tissue between the interesting parts. The journey is where the interesting parts actually live. So let's pull Osaru back out of that tidy chapter break and drop her into the actual reality of the Frost Marches. Because the moment we do, the failure of the fast travel approach becomes physically obvious. Her 2,000 loyalists do not move as a clean rectangle on a map. They stretch nearly 3 miles down a single icy road, with the vanguard of royal guards out front, the noble carriages and supply wagons in the bloated middle, and the rear guard somewhere behind, half blind to whatever's happening at the head of the column. Then, at one point up ahead, one wagon carrying part of the camp gear hits a rut under the snow. The wheel cracks, and the whole front section has to stop, while men wrestle with frozen wood and half-working tools. On paper that sounds minor, but inside a moving column, that is true poison. The whole travels backward in waves, and every section behind the wagon receives the problem late. And now Osaru's swift retreat has become a jammed artery in open country. That's the slinky effect. One compression near the front creates a chain of collisions all the way down the body of the group. And the longer the column is, the more violent that ripple becomes. Anybody who sat in highway traffic has felt the civilian version of this. One driver taps the brakes, and 10 minutes later people half a mile back are fully stopped without ever seeing the cause. This is the thing the montage erased entirely. The fast travel version of the scene gave us a leader at the gate and a leader at the fortress, with a clean line of prose stitching them together. But the reframed version reveals that Osara's actual job, the thing she was put on the page to do, is to stand inside that few minutes cascade and figure out what to say first. The older approach was structurally doomed because it assumed the journey was something happening to Osara that the writer could politely look away from, when the journey was always the only place Osara could prove she deserved the crown she was running to defend. So understanding that, we execute phase 1, which I think of as the beast burden. The principle that any faction on the move is shackled to the physical needs of whatever is carrying its survival. In Osara's case, that means the heavy wagons hauling their surviving winter tents, and those wagons are pulled by oxen, and the oxen are dying. The frost has scorched every blade of forage along the route, the grass is buried under 2 feet of snow, and the animals that were supposed to keep the tents moving are now eating into their own muscle mass, with every mile they pull. Osara's quartermaster, a man who has been awake for 40 hours and is already missing 2 fingers to frostbite from previous travels, rides up alongside her near the broken wagon and tells her the math directly. The oxen will collapse within 3 days unless they are fed, and the only food left in the column that they can digest is the human grain ration. Which means Osara is now standing in the snow, watching her people unload a splintered wheel and holding a choice that no fast travel sentence could ever convey. Every sack of grain fed to the oxen means less food for the people who already escaped a coup and are now marching on numb feet toward uncertain refuge. Every sack withheld means the animals weaken further, which means the tent wagons slow, then stall, then become dead weight. And once those tents stop moving, the 2,000 loyalists lose the only barrier between their bodies and the snow. Notice what just happened here. Logistics became drama the second the resource had competing lives attached to it. Osara isn't deciding between efficient and inefficient. She's deciding who gets to live another day. Feed the grain to the people and morale holds for an evening while the beasts decline. Feed the grain to the oxen and hungry families watch their ruler protect canvas over children's stomachs, even though she knows the canvas is the only reason those children may wake up tomorrow. That's horrible, which is exactly why it works. There is no clever third option, one that makes the grain magically multiply. There's only a young ruler, barely 2 weeks into her reign, looking at a quartermaster and deciding which of her people she is willing to harm in order to save the rest. And whatever she chooses, the reader is going to remember it for the entire rest of the book. The crazy part is that none of this required the writer to invent some external villain or contrived obstacle. The beast burden was already baked into the premise the moment Osara left the city with 2,000 people and a herd of draft animals. The writer just had to stop skipping past it and start letting the physics do the work. Once Osara makes her call, and let's say she chooses the oxen because the tents are the only thing keeping the children alive at night, the Foundation immediately starts generating new pressure on its own. The Royal Guard captain, for example, a hardened veteran named Sir Vale, who has been pushing for speed since the moment they cleared the city walls, rides up to Osara that evening with a sharper version of the same argument he's been making for days. His vanguard could be 12 miles ahead by morning, scouting the pass and securing the only bridge across the Kelvon Gorge before the usurper's outriders reach it. But they cannot because they are tethered to a logistical anchor that is now moving slower than a man on foot. Every hour the oxen rest, the pursuers gain ground. And every mile the column stretches to accommodate the slowing wagons, the rear guard becomes more exposed. And every grain ration that goes into an animal's mouth, that's a ration that doesn't go into a soldier's. Which means the men who would have to fight at that bridge are getting weaker at the exact pace the bridge is becoming more important. Notice what just happened to the plot. We didn't need to introduce a new threat to generate tension. The tension is now metastasizing out of a single decision Osara made about food, rippling forward into a military crisis at a bridge she hasn't even reached yet, and rippling backward into a moral crisis among soldiers who are watching their food disappear into an animal's throat. That is what good structural architecture does. It doesn't resolve pressure, it manufactures more of it organically, from the choices the protagonist has already been forced to make. And the writer's job becomes less about inventing problems and more about staying out of the way of the ones the system is generating on its own. Building environments that actively attack your characters like this, geography that creates a conflict instead of just hosting it, is exactly what I break down in the minimum viable world module inside the complete system for writing your fantasy novel. and you can grab the full course through the link in the description below. Now, the reason I'm pointing it out here is that the Beast Burden only works if the world underneath it is engineered to bite back, and most world building advice teaches you to build pretty maps instead of hostile ones. Once your geography is doing the heavy lifting though, problems like Osara's oxen stop feeling like contrivances the writer imposed and start feeling like inevitabilities the world itself produced. Osara feeding her grain to the oxen isn't a travel scene, it's a coronation scene, disguised as one. Because the rebel council at Keldrath is going to ask her what kind of queen she intends to be, and she now has a real, blood-on-the-snow answer that the reader watched her arrive at in real time. That answer could not have existed in the fast travel version of this manuscript. It can only exist on a road that was allowed to hurt her, and the moment the writer accepts that the road is supposed to hurt, every other element of the journey starts pulling its weight. The wagons, the animals, the rationing, the cascading delays, the impossible negotiations between the captain who wants to sprint and the quartermaster who needs to crawl. Still though, none of that is the hardest part of writing a faction on the move. Oxen at least are predictable. A starving animal will always behave like a starving animal, and a broken axle will always need the same number of hours to repair. People are a different problem entirely. Now, obviously Osara's column doesn't actually contain 2,000 soldiers. It contains maybe 300 royal guards, and the rest is something far more dangerous to manage. A moving city of court nobles who have never slept on the ground, household servants who were dragged into exile without a vote, and entire civilian families who fled the capital because staying meant execution. These people have no marching discipline whatsoever, and the moment the frost marches start biting in earnest, that lack of discipline transforms into something Osara genuinely cannot fix with just willpower or speeches. On one of the nights when the temperature drops below what the tents were rated for, the civilian section of the column simply stops obeying. Lord Merrick's household refuses to share their reserve blankets with the servants in the next tent over, even after Osara's quartermaster orders the redistribution. 2 families are caught stealing grain from a wagon that was supposed to feed the oxen. The same oxen Osara already chose to protect at the cost of human rations. And when the guards try to enforce punishment, the family's neighbors close ranks and physically block the arrest. By morning, the rigid marching formation Osara drilled into the column on day 1 has dissolved entirely. Nobles refuse to walk behind servants, while a cluster of merchant families simply sits down on the icy road demanding hot food. Phase 1 cannot solve this. The Beast Burden framework assumes the burden is at least cooperative. It relies on the idea that the animals want to eat and the people pulling the wagons share a survival interest with the leader at the front. A moving city of frightened civilians, however, shares no such interest in the moment of panic, and Osara is suddenly staring at a foundation crack that no amount of resource math can patch. She is leading a faction that is actively refusing to be led. This is the exact spot where most writers panic, and many reach for one of 2 escape hatches that look reasonable on the surface but quietly destroy everything built so far. The first hatch is the inspiring speech. Osara climbs onto a wagon, delivers a stirring monologue about loyalty and the future of the kingdom, and the civilians wipe their tears, pick up their bundles, and fall into perfect formation behind her. But the problem is that nothing in the established world supports that outcome. These are not soldiers who have spent years internalizing a chain of command. They are pampered nobles whose feet are bleeding for the first time in their lives. And a single speech from a 20-year-old queen they barely trust isn't going to override a lifetime of soft living and a week of genuine trauma. The reader knows this instinctively, and the moment the speech works, the manuscript loses its honesty. Now the second hatch then is even worse. The writer simply forgets the civilians exist during the hard scenes. When the pursuers from the capital finally catch up, the prose suddenly describes Osara's 300 guards forming a clean defensive line, and the 1700 civilians who were just looting each other's tent quietly evaporate into the background until the fight is over. The moving city becomes like a Schrödinger's faction, present when the writer wants atmosphere, absent when the writer wants tactics. And the reader feels to cheat even if they cannot name it. But with that said, there's even a third temptation worth naming, which is to have Osara crack down with brutal force, execute a few looters as an example, and terrify the rest into compliance. This one at least respects the world's logic, but it costs Osara the moral authority she needs at Keldrath, where she has to walk into a rebel council and argue that she's a better ruler than the usurper who just murdered her family for the crown. A queen who lines up frostbitten merchants in the snow has no clean argument left to make here. So every escape hatch closes while the entire wall of challenges around her stay standing. And then on top of it, the pursuers arrive. The outriders of Lord Castaigne the Usurper, which are comprised of fast cavalry sent from the capital to finish what the coup started, appear on ridge behind the column at midday, maybe 2 hours from contact. And the civilian section of the moving city does exactly what undisciplined civilians do when they see armed riders on a horizon. They panic and run forward into the road, blocking it completely. The royal guards who were supposed to form a rear line are now trapped behind a wall of screaming nobles and overturned handcarts, unable to even reach the rear of the column to engage the threat. Ozara has only minutes, if not seconds, to make a decision here, and the decision she makes is the one that separates her from every protagonist who tries to demand order from chaos. She stops fighting the chaos and starts using it. She rides to the bloated middle of the column where the heavy noble carriages that have been slowing the march since day one are clocked together in a panicked knot. Without hesitation, she orders her guards to shatter the axles with warhammers. Not move them, break them. Within minutes, 20 of the heaviest carriages in the column collapse into the snow at deliberate angles across the narrow mountain road. And the lords who own these carriages are screaming at her in the snow while the guards keep swinging. Lord Castaigne's outriders hit the barricade at full gallop and break against it like surf against a seawall. Suddenly, the moving city, this slow, bloated, undisciplined liability that Ozara has been bleeding rations to keep alive for a week, has just become the only reason her column survived the afternoon. Now, the reason this reversal lands as inevitable rather than convenient comes down to a structural principle most writers never articulate. The protagonist's competence is proven by the moment they stop trying to make the situation into something it isn't, and start exploiting what it actually is. You see, for days, Ozara has been treating her civilians as a military formation that simply needs better discipline, and that approach has been failing because the civilians were never going to be soldiers. The breakthrough for her comes when she accepts the foundational truth her own world has been screaming at her. Given that these people are slow and entirely incapable of clean tactical movement, she asks the only question that matters once you stop fighting reality. What is this liability actually good at? Well, bloated, luxury-obsessed civilians are very good at producing massive, immovable luxury objects in the middle of narrow roads. The pursuer's greatest weapon is speed, and the column's greatest weakness is mass. So Ozara converts mass into a weapon against speed, and the equation flips on contact. This is the move that earns her the crown in the reader's mind, because anyone can lead a disciplined army, but only a real ruler can look at a screaming group of civilians and make something out of it. Ultimately, Ozara didn't survive the Frost Marches by becoming a better general. She survived by becoming a queen who could weaponize her own people's weaknesses without losing the right to lead them. But her decisions, however, ripple outward even further. The carriages Ozara shattered on that mountain road do not stay on that mountain road. Splintered axles freeze in the snow behind her, but the political wreckage rides into Keldreth in the bones of every noble who watched their family heirlooms get destroyed by a queen they were supposed to trust. Lord Merrick particularly walked the last 40 miles of the Frost Marches in boots that didn't fit, and by the time he sees the rebel stronghold rising out of the pines, the gratitude he might have felt for surviving the ambush has long since calcified into something colder. His wife lost a toe to frostbite on that march, and his youngest son carried a bundle through the snow that used to be carried by a servant who didn't survive the same crossing. So for Lord Merrick, every step of that bundle is now a ledger entry against the woman who saved his life by destroying his property. Honestly, this is the part most writers never see coming, because saving someone in fiction is supposed to buy a loyalty, when in reality saving someone often buys resentment with interest attached. Ozara arrives at Keldreth with less than 2,000 survivors, which include a faction of furious lords who have spent every freezing night of the march rehearsing the speech they're going to give the Rebel Council the moment she turns her back. The Rebel Council, of course, was already skeptical of a young queen showing up with a coup at her heels, and now they have a ready-made internal opposition handing them ammunition before the negotiations even start. Lord Castaigne, the usurper back in the capital, doesn't even need spies inside Keldreth to learn this. The news of the broken carriages is going to walk into his throne room on its own legs, because alienated nobles write letters, and letters cross borders. That single decision Ozara made on a frozen mountain road has now seeded a mutiny, handing her enemy a diplomatic opening she won't see closing for another 200 pages. The journey didn't end at Keldreth. The journey just started laying eggs in the rest of the manuscript. Now with that said, the danger here is that once a writer feels how much narrative power lives inside logistical suffering, they might fall completely in love with the suffering itself and forget the story was supposed to be moving somewhere. You see, a lot of writers hit this wall the moment they realize that travel sequences can carry real weight, so they pour every ounce of misery they can find into the marching column. You might end up writing 5 consecutive chapters of frostbitten toes, or stacking endless scenes of servants complaining about ration sizes. Each scene is technically true to the world, and each one technically deserves a place in the manuscript, but stacked on top of each other, they stop generating pressure and start generating sludge. Osara's authority quietly erodes in a different way here. Instead of looking ruthless, she starts looking helpless, because every chapter shows her presiding over misery she never resolves. The reader's investment in reaching Keldrath drowns under the weight of 1,000 minor complaints, and the rebel stronghold stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like a rumor. The crazy part is that the writer who falls into this trap usually thinks they are doing the brave thing, sitting with the discomfort instead of skipping it, when really they've just swapped one form of avoidance for another. While fast traveling skips the journey entirely, wallowing trades the same journey for a grim aesthetic that goes absolutely nowhere. The self-edit that fixes this is brutally simple, and I use it on every travel sequence I touch. Ultimately, every scene of logistical misery has to force the protagonist to change a decision they had already made. If a chapter of frozen suffering ends with Osara doing exactly what she planned to do that morning, the chapter is decoration, and the chapter has to be cut. Now on the other hand, a scene where the oxen weaken and Osara has to choose between feeding them or her people, that earns its place, because the next mile of the march is materially different because of that. You see, misery is either a catalyst for something more, or the misery is cut entirely. Apply that test to every travel chapter in your draft, and entire sections will disappear overnight, and the ones that survive will feel like magic. And calibrating that exact line between enough grit to feel real and so much grit the plot drowns, that's the kind of structural problem my full system was built to solve. So enroll today and ensure your travel chapters build momentum instead of killing it. The link is still in the description below. When an author actually nails the balance between the chaos of the moving city and the queen who learns to weaponize it, the payoff the reader experiences on the other side is something almost no other narrative structure can deliver. When Osara finally rides through the gates of Keldrath, she isn't the same woman who fled the capital with her breath fogging in the freezing air 23 days earlier. The young royal who stood at the city walls watching her people pour through has been burned out of her by the road itself, and what walks into the rebel stronghold in her place is something the council has never seen before. A queen who has already made the kind of decisions most rulers spend their entire reigns avoiding. She fed grain to oxen while children watched their rations shrink. She broke the carriages of the lords sitting beside her at the negotiation table. She traded the loyalty of half her nobility for the survival of the whole column. And she did it on a frozen mountain road with a quartermaster who was already missing fingers as her only counsel. By the time she sits down across from the rebel council, she doesn't have to argue she deserves the support. The argument walked into the fortress with her in the form of 1,800 survivors who are alive specifically because she was willing to be ruthless on their behalf. The fast travel version of Osara would have arrived at this same table with nothing but a title and a sob story. That's the irreversible payoff of refusing the shortcut. Once the road has hurt the protagonist into a real person, every scene that follows inherits that weight for free. You can see this exact architecture at work in A Song of Ice and Fire, where George R. R. Martin sends Daenerys Targaryen, a young exiled queen with a small vulnerable people of her own, across the Red Waste, a stretch of dead earth that kills almost everything that tries to cross it. For viewers who haven't read the books, Daenerys at this point is barely more than a teenager, recently widowed, leading the starving remnants of her late husband's followers with 3 newly hatched dragons too small to defend anyone. Martin doesn't fast travel her across the wasteland. He makes us participate in that crossing. The narrative forces us to watch horses die of thirst, lingering on the corpses piling up behind the column day by day as blood riders ride out into the waste, knowing they will never return. By the time Daenerys reaches the city of Quorth on the other side, she has buried enough of her own followers to understand what leadership actually costs, and the reader has buried them alongside her. This is why her later scenes in Quorth and Astapor land with the weight they do. The reader has already watched her pay for the ride to be taken seriously, and no amount of dialogue at the destination could have manufactured that weight from scratch. Now, Martin almost certainly didn't sit down with a checklist labeled Beast Burden in Moving City, of course. I just used those terms to organize my own process. But Martin still refused to look away from the journey. And when an author commits to the brutal honesty of logistics, these structural principles emerge completely on their own. When Osawa walks into Keldreth, the reader doesn't just intellectually understand that the crossing was hard. They feel the cold in their own hands, carrying the political weight of every broken carriage like a debt they personally took on. The survival of those 1800 loyalists stops being a fact the author handed them and becomes a victory they participated in, mile by frozen mile. And that participation is the deepest hook a novel can sink. A reader who has merely been told a journey was difficult will close the book and forget it within a week. But a reader who has bled through that journey alongside the protagonist will carry their manuscript around in their chest for years, because the story didn't happen to them on the page, it happened inside them while they were reading. The destination earns its name only when the road has cost something on the way there, and once that cost is paid in full, the entire rest of the manuscript gets to stand on a foundation no shortcut could ever provide. What Osawa's Frozen Road teaches us here is that geography only matters when it costs something, and this same brutal logic governs every coin in your protagonist's purse. Once you fix the journey, the next load-bearing wall is the economy underneath it. A world that provides actual challenges will still fall apart if its currency and trade routes are pure decoration. I break down exactly how to architect that next layer in my video on why a fantasy economy makes zero sense. Watch that one next.